Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for stopping by the Madison Museum of Contemporary Art for this afternoon's Artist Talk by cultureindustry.club, a collaboration between the artists Zach Kaiser and Gabi Schaffzin. I'd like to begin with an acknowledgement of the Ho-Chunk people on whose ancestral land Madison was built, and recognize the 11 other First Nations of Wisconsin. Now is your reminder to silence all cell phones and electronic devices, though while you're checking the volume levels, feel free to quickly open up your favorite social media app and follow the museum at MMoCA Madison to stay in the loop about other upcoming talks and events. Today's talk is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Imaginary Eye, on display in the museum's main galleries through April 7th. The exhibition explores the similarities between artists, scientists, and mathematicians as they explore and seek out unknown worlds and concepts, project future and undiscovered realities, and reclaim, retrace, and reveal the patterns around us. The connection between art and science is most evident in science fiction storytelling, which at its heart serves as an exploration of the potential consequences of scientific and technological innovations. Science fiction media, such as books, television shows, and movies, have therefore served as inspiration for countless technological innovations. Martin Cooper, the man credited with the invention of the first handheld cellular phone in the 1970s, has stated that his prototypes were directly inspired by the communicators from the original Star Trek series. The automatic doors in Star Trek also inspired the automatic sensors found in doors to grocery stores and gas stations. Other examples of life imitating art and the fantastical ideas of sci-fi writers becoming reality include smartwatches, which were first featured in the TV show The Jetsons, and mobile tablet computers, which were popularized by Sir Arthur Clarke's screenplay in 2001, A Space Odyssey. However, science fiction does not solely foresee utopias created by advancements in technology. In 1909, the British author E.M. Forster wrote the only piece of science fiction he would ever write, a novella called The Machine Stops, a warning that significantly advanced technology can also serve as a prison. In the novella, the machine is a technological network that supplies all of the citizens' needs. Similar to the spaceship in the movie WALL-E, an artificial intelligence has created a milieu where humanity is complacent and unthinking with no real agency of their own. You may also see similarities in the Matrix movies. The installation Blessed is the Machine, inspired by the E.M. Forster novella, is a self-aware computational system alive with data yet critical of the very activities in which it is engaged. An AI avatar makes inferences about visitors' emotions and recommends products to them while considering the local weather, local news stories, and stock market fluctuations and local traffic patterns. The algorithm then decides what is important and is usually not the response given by the visitor. The installation serves as a warning about datafication of humanity and how we are constantly subject to predictive personalization under the guise of convenience, efficiency, and innovation to our detriment. Today's talk, Art, Computing, and AI, How the Proverbial Sausage is Made and Why You Should Worry More About the Proverbial Sausage-Making Process, features the artist's development of Blessed is the Machine as a lens through which to examine the development of AI systems, the assumptions of both hype builders and hand-wringers, and the dangerous consequences of discourse that does not address the history and the political economy of computing itself. Zachary Kaiser is an associate professor of graphic design and experience architecture at Michigan State University, whose research and creative practice examines the politics of technology and the role of design in shaping the parameters of individual, social, and political assembly. Gabi Schaffzin is an artist, educator, and researcher currently based in Toronto, where he is an assistant professor of the Department of Design at New York University School of Arts, Media, Performance, and Design. Please join me in welcoming Zach Kaiser and Gabi Schaffzin to the stage.
Hi, everybody. I'm Zach. This is Gabi. I'm going to move this out of the way. Okay, cool. Today's talk, Art, Computing, and AI, How the Proverbial Sausage is Made, and Why You Should Worry About the Proverbial Sausage-Making Process. The title was actually inspired by Bob. So, Bob, thank you so much for giving us our title here. Before we get started, we want to offer some thank yous. First to Christina, who was the director here for a long time. She took a chance on our project and was amazing to work with. We'd also like to thank the education team, Bob and Dinda. Where's Dinda? Dinda, there you are. Thank you so much for helping contextualize our work and share it with other people. Andrew and Roxy, I don't know if Andrew's here somewhere, but Andrew and Roxy are like the media and comms crew, and they did an amazing job promoting our work, making videos about it. Like, again, just incredible job. Bruce and Mark, who did so much help with the install and built things for us, and they were amazing. And we got to thank Tim and Paige. So Tim couldn't be here, but Tim was amazing to work with and coordinated and facilitated a number of the things that we had to get done. So Tim's on a beach somewhere drinking a pina colada. And Paige, who wears many hats here at the museum, and I think at this point, Paige is sitting there. Paige, can you raise your hand, please? Paige literally at this point deserves to have her name on the wall as a collaborator. She's been incredible to work with, and I'm so grateful for her help and friendship. So thanks, Paige. All right, now we'll get started. Bob said a lot of this, but I'm going to do it again, I guess. In 1909, E.M. Forster, the famed British author, wrote the only piece of science fiction he would ever write. Crazy. It was called The Machine Stops, and it was published in the Oxford and Cambridge Review. Forster's story anticipated most of the technological underpinnings of our society today. The internet, telepresence like Zoom and FaceTime, virtual reality, augmented reality, streaming music, and video. But far from a technological utopia, Forster's story was a warning. In that future in which the machine stops takes place, humanity has become a subterranean species, living separately in small honeycomb-like units, connected only by the machine, a gigantic technological network that supplies all the citizens' needs. In the world of the machine, human beings live isolated in the confined and protective spaces of small subterranean rooms, refusing all contact with the external world because they prefer the simulation of experience to experience itself. Little more than simulacra themselves, they are fulfilled by a pseudo-reality made up of voices, sounds, and evanescent images, abstract sensations that can be evoked by pressing a few buttons. Citizens of this dystopian world state see themselves not as living in a dystopia, but instead as members of a technologically advanced society. Quantification and rationalization of everything, even human contact, is essential to their cultural orthodoxy of appearing to be efficient and advanced. Sound familiar? This obsession with optimization extends to the intellectual life of the citizenry, who have exchanged imagination for ideas, having reduced ideas to empirical data and making their function one of social utility. Indeed, being deemed unmechanical is a sin of sorts, punishable by homelessness, being cast out to Earth's surface, which is, in Forster's imagined future, completely uninhabitable. Their commitment to rational mechanization is matched only by their fervent quasi-religious devotion to the machine, the user's manual to which, the book, is seen as a Bible of sorts. Blessed is the machine, they tell one another. This mantra, blessed is the machine, is the name that our project upstairs in the imprint gallery bears. The characters' faith in the machine, a faith derived from their reliance on it to provide everything they need, which in turn produces more faith, which in turn produces a stronger reliance, and so on, should not sound unfamiliar. Today, from venture capitalists to cash-strapped nonprofits, it seems as though the Church of Computation, and AI specifically, has recruited devotees from nearly every domain of society. But Zach, you might ask, what does all of this have to do with sausage? Well, the metaphor of how the sausage is made, as well as a lesser-known sausage corollary, which is how the consumption of the sausage becomes normalized, is apt if we step back and consider our futurological soothsayers like Elon Musk or Mark Andreessen, who hail our computational future without talking about what's required to make that future a reality, if that reality is even possible. And spoiler alert, it's not. Part of why we made Blessed is the Machine, and part of why we invoke Forster's story, is because we worry that the proverbial sausage-making process and the consequences of a reliance on the proverbial sausage is so deleterious to so many parts of society and the environment that it outweighs any potential benefits the proverbial sausage might yield.
So we're going to split the metaphorical sausage making up into 3 parts. First, the environment and materials. Second, the probability and the human as computer. And third, anti-democratic innovation and technological solutionism. Finally, we'll wrap up with some discussion on what we can do given the problems we've laid out. But first, let's hear from Alex Reben. This is not Alex. This is a piece that Alex made. But Alex is the first artist in residence at OpenAI. He says, in reference to generative AI, that, quote, given how young this creative tool is, much still needs to be solved, and confronting these problems falls on the shoulders of everyone involved, from its developers to its users. The more people thinking about these questions, the better. This is Alex. But, says a glowing New York Times profile about his work, as a technologist who had studied the impact of innovations like photography and recorded music on creativity, he usually stays on the cautiously optimistic side. We find this to be a patently bad faith argument. The genuinely important questions that reflect the material circumstances in which AI technologies are developed, as well as the political economic situation from which such technologies emerge, suggest that OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, and the project of generative artificial intelligence writ large should perhaps not even exist in the first place. Now, before we begin talking about the making of the sausage, we got to talk briefly, at least, about the making of the sausage factory, and we're going to dispose of the sausage metaphor for the time being, just for a few minutes. So, also with apologies to the vegetarians or vegans in the group. These are vegan sausages in the photo. Basically, what I'm saying is that you can't talk about AI without talking at least a little bit about how computers are made. Building and maintaining the computers that run quote-unquote cloud-based AI systems like ChatGPT is an extractive and massively environmentally damaging process. Note that the cloud is not some immaterial thing floating in the sky, but rather giant warehouses full of servers, and as we all know, servers are computers. Now, these computers are made out of lots of different things, and they get quite hot when they do all the AI magic to which we've grown accustomed. As Kate Crawford and Vladin Yaller write, put simply, each small amount of convenience requires a vast planetary network fueled by the extraction of non-renewable materials, labor, and data. A full accounting for these costs is almost impossible. Now, our inability to account for these costs is, for the companies that own these technologies, a feature, not a bug. Because these systems are so opaque, so impenetrable and impossible to understand, with many companies like Apple going through third-party suppliers multiple times over, companies themselves don't even really know where the materials for their servers are coming from. This gives them plausible deniability for all sorts of stuff. Let's look at one tiny example. This is coltan, a rare earth mineral that appears in basically all of our computers. All computing requires capacitors, like the one here, tiny electrical components soldered to the motherboard that alter DC voltage to match other components like graphic cards or hard drives, and they hold or store an electric charge for use at a later time. The element tantalum, which is made from refined coltan, has unusual properties that make it well suited for use in capacitors. But tantalum mining is highly damaging. According to Olawole Ojewale, coltan is mined through digging large craters in stream beds, scraping away soil from the surface to get to the coltan underground, which causes massive erosion. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, the leading producer of tantalum, has lost 8.6% of its tree cover since 2000, much of this due to mining, with many miners violating sites of historical heritage. The loss of trees has begun to destroy ecosystems, decrease the carbon stock, disrupt the photosynthesis process, and affect air quality. And it also has affected wildlife habitats. For instance, in the Kahuzi-Biega National Park, one of the last sanctuaries for the critically endangered eastern lowland gorilla, coltan mining has destroyed much of the gorilla's natural habitat, leaving them vulnerable to poachers. Now, the population of eastern lowland gorillas plummeted from 8,000 in the park in 1991, when coltan mining started there, to about 40 in 2005. The present population is now estimated at 250, but the process of mineral separation and sorting is done manually through washing at streams and rivers. The chemicals used are polluting water bodies and are harmful to aquatic life and produce radioactive substances that are detrimental to human health. And this is just part of the environmental cost of tantalum and coltan industries. This doesn't even address the fact that coltan is conceived of broadly as a conflict mineral, meaning that armed groups in places like the DRC sometimes use mining to finance their operations. Meanwhile, companies in the DRC operate with impunity, exploiting a labor force beleaguered by civil war and suffering the legacy of colonial exploitation by the Belgians. And then metals need to be transported and refined, both heavily polluting activities, the details of which we just don't have time to get into today. And even if you think, okay, well, once all the environmental damage from making the servers that run the quote-unquote cloud on the AI systems so many people love are built, surely that's got to be the end of the dire environmental costs. But of course not. Just a couple statistics to give you a sense of the damage. Training one single instance of ChatGPT could power the average American home for roughly 120 years. By 2040, server farms may account for 14% of global carbon emissions. Training a large but off-the-shelf AI model, the kind that takes like 8 GPUs or 8 like video cards basically, 3.5 days to train, can emit as much CO2 as flying round trip between New York and Beijing 125 times. By 2030, data centers will consume as much energy as Japan, the fourth biggest energy consumer on the planet. Data centers pull from clean, freshwater sources to avoid corrosion and bacteria growth and for humidity control. Water used to cool GPT servers tends to be returned to water sources like lakes, ponds, and streams at much higher temperatures than are survivable for wildlife and plants that live there, effectively cooking them to death. An average user's conversational exchange with ChatGPT basically amounts to dumping a 500 milliliter bottle of fresh water out on the ground, all while 2.2 million U.S. residents lack water and basic indoor plumbing, and another 44 million live with inadequate water systems. And we can't ignore the fact that all of this stuff, what Marx called primitive accumulation, is part and parcel of capitalism writ large. Capitalism is extractive and exploitative by its very nature, and it incentivizes and even demands it. The extraction and exploitation is not as visible for us in the 21st century as it once was, often being offloaded to places that were once colonies of the very countries in which corporations like Google and Meta are headquartered. The servers on which AI runs, but also your phones and Apples and Google Home devices, all, to paraphrase Benjamin Bratton, use their gloss to conceal the gore that lies within. This point, that the political economic system within which AI emerges has certain fundamental properties that determine, to a great extent, the development of new technologies, is something we'll come back to frequently throughout this talk, and indeed, as the motto of one of our favorite podcasts goes, it was capitalism all along. And I suppose instead of hammering that extremely depressing section on to all of our audience members, we could have just shown this meme, which is all the terrible things we've been talking about to this point in the talk, revealed to just be capitalism. Probabilistic modeling is at the core of all generative AI. ChatGPT, for example, always picks its next word based on probabilities. AI that creates images is basically picking pixel by pixel values based on probabilities as well. Same with generative video, only with the added axis of time. But there's a very long history of things that are probabilistic going very badly for humans, and so that's what I'm going to talk about right now. The history of probability and statistics, and how its influence over the human sciences has been so damaging to our ideas about people, what we are, and what we're capable of. So, we start with a star, okay? It's like the early to middle of the 1800s, and you are looking up at the sky, and you're looking for the star. You know what it's called, you know that it's in a general area, but you need to find it, and so you find it in point A. And Zach, who lives in, say, France.
Bonjour.
sees it in a different spot. And then I look up and I see it in a different spot. And then you start collecting other observers and they see the same star, but in slightly different spots. But as you collect all of these locations, right, these spottings, you discover that they start to sort of cluster in one area. So what you do is you draw a grid, an imaginary grid over this sky. And you notice that a lot of them are in this grid here, and we'll call that grid spot H. And so what you start to do then is you start to map and you start to plot how many times was this same star reported as being seen in each quadrant. And if any of you are currently in undergraduate at UW across the street, you'll recognize this form from when you're obsessing over how your exams are being graded. This is a bell curve. Okay, and so here we have decided that because most of the stars are in quadrant H, that the star must actually be in quadrant H. And so that's what this man, Adolphe Quetelet, he is the one who decided that that's what we would say. We would look at the bell curve, we'd plot its points, and we'd say this is where it is. And he was sort of taken by this phenomenon. And what he decided was, there must be other things that we can apply this to, right? And one of those things must be people. So he got I think it was Switzerland or France. I know I've been saying France, and then just now I realized it might have been Switzerland. The military of this nation, and he takes the height of every soldier, and he plots it along this histogram, this bell curve, and he basically says, okay, we can now determine the average man. Right? Until this point in the mid-1800s, we had not been thinking about what the average man looks like. Now, some of you may recognize this individual. This is Francis Galton. Here he is being photographed like a criminal, although he was never arrested as a criminal. I'll get to this one in a second. But you might recognize Francis Galton's name from the history of something called eugenics. Right? Now, eugenics is basically this idea that we can sort of engineer the way that humans populate, and I'll just use the term breed, and reproduce, so that only those on the far right side of the bell curve, that is the exceptional individuals, are the ones that survive, okay? And so these ideas that we could classify and determine how somebody would be, how smart they would be, whether or not they'd be a criminal, it really proliferated throughout Europe in the 1800s, including by a guy named Alphonse Bertillon. And Bertillon created this lab, a criminal identification laboratory in Paris in 1893. And Galton was so taken by this individual who had used Galton's stuff that he then went and visited Bertillon and was photographed like a criminal would have been. Now, again, Galton was basically the inventor of eugenics. And here he is. I thought this was a really entertaining way of characterizing him, as showing him very clearly he's troubled by what he hath wrought on the world, although he never really was. And this is HowStuffWorks.com suggests that eugenics overshadows the legacy of scientific genius Francis Galton. And here I would suggest that overshadows is doing a significant amount of work in that headline. Now, you might think, okay, Gabi, that's the 1800s. What are we talking about now? And the truth is that these principles are still with us today. In fact, the last time that a eugenics-related law, and this was about forced sterilization on human beings who were considered to not be worthy of reproduction, the last time that a law like that came off the books in the United States was in the 1970s in California. Okay, so we're not talking about ancient history here by any means. And in fact, this is a very famous paper. This is from a very famous paper wherein it was the early 2000s to early 2010s, where this team of researchers decided that they could use computers to average faces. And so they took a bunch of people who identified as heterosexual, a bunch of people who identified as gay, and they used a computer to average the pieces of their face. And then they used the points on their face using computer vision technology, and they said, this is what a gay face looks like. This is what a heterosexual face looks like.
Hello, eugenics!
Yeah, right? I mean, at least we're past that period of
Totally,
human
glad we're past that.
Probabilistic modeling and the dynamic categorization of people is central to predictive analytical systems. Again, are you gay, are you straight, based on the probability of where the things on your face are, right? And they're central to these systems that are used in vast arrays of industries, from academia to the criminal justice system. Ian Hacking, the famed historian of statistics, writes that when we use tools to classify people in new ways, we essentially create new kinds of people. And this process is cyclical. So by using statistics and probability to produce predictions about people, scientists, including those in medicine, linguistics, psychology, psychiatry, and computer science, have come to shape our own subjectivities. In other words, who or what we think we are. And here's a diagram of how Netflix's recommendation algorithm works. Today, computational inference and prediction is everywhere, from Netflix to Amazon to municipal infrastructure. But for computational probabilistic modeling to appear as useful, it first has to appear accurate, even if it isn't. This requires that people view themselves as being made up of nothing but data and operating computationally. So, for instance, that Zach's mom's sleep score is more real than how she felt about how well she slept. Zach's mom is right there if you'd like to ask her about it after the talk. My mom doesn't use a sleep score. It is this datafication, not that there's anything wrong with it. It is this datafication, we'll talk about that, and the requisite belief in its validity and completeness that is reflected in the data cacophony that visitors experience when they interact with the piece upstairs. But what happens when we come to adopt this computable subjectivity? The data about us becomes more real than our own lived experience. And this is precisely what our AI friend upstairs might tell you. Indeed, we now live in a world that privileges machine legibility over human legibility, a world where an entry someone occupies in a company's database is considered more real than that person's lived experience. And this is precisely what Forster was suggesting would happen, that people experience a simulation of everything instead of the thing itself. Indeed, a mantra of the machine's most devoted acolytes is, beware of first-hand ideas. If we are not careful, we will soon live in a world that functions in a way that is completely incomprehensible to people, but perfectly suited to stochastic parrots. We'll be completely clueless about why certain things are happening to us, why we've been classified in particular ways, allowed or disallowed certain social privileges, criminalized, or potentially even killed. Major law firms which are working on cases involving real people's personal bodily injuries have used ChatGPT to help them file briefs that end up filled with fabricated cases and references to non-existent precedents. Meanwhile, chatbots that replace human employees at crisis centers and helplines have delivered harmful responses and even driven some actual people to suicide. Life is becoming just like Kafka's story, The Trial, in which, per Daniel Solovey, quote, a bureaucracy with inscrutable purposes uses people's information to make important decisions about them, yet denies the people the ability to participate in how their information is used. And no, it is not lost on us that one of the pieces used in Netflix's algorithm is a technology called Kafka.
Why does no one understand irony anymore?
There's one other thing that is required for computational probabilistic models to become seen as useful within our current political economic system, and that is people need to believe in individual solutions to systemic problems. Under neoliberalism, individual people are held responsible for problems that they themselves did not necessarily produce. For instance, you're a single mom, you're driving for Uber at night, you're teaching first graders during the day. It's actually your fault that you don't have enough free time to exercise and eat right, and that means that it's your fault that your health insurance premiums are going up or that you can't even get enough life insurance. This mindset ignores the fact that teachers should actually be paid a living wage and that everyone deserves access to healthcare, healthy food, and enough time to be active. Today's most popular consumer technologies tell us that we should seek to optimize ourselves and that seeing ourselves as computers is the best way to achieve this optimization. Users then must legitimize themselves on the terms of those very technologies. You're not real until the numbers prove it. You haven't exercised enough until your watch's interface tells you that you have. You aren't happy until your emotion tracking platform tells you that you sound happy. On an individual scale, this is bad enough, but because this view has its roots in neoliberalism, digital technologies become weaponized to further atomize us and entrench the status quo more deeply, something that Zach is now going to talk about.
Oh, I am. All right. The last part of our discussion here, anti-democratic innovation and technological solutionism. Okay, so what we've laid out thus far are the environmental and social requirements for the production of sausage.
I think they're over the sausage.
They're over the sausage metaphor. Blame that one on Bob. We have one more sausage-making component to discuss. The fact that none of us regular folks have a say in the sausage-making process. Or whether or not we even need said sausage in the first place. In other words, we don't have a say in any of the decisions about how AI technologies are built or used, or, like I just said, whether they're even necessary. The US, as political theorist Camila Vergara compellingly demonstrates, is an oligarchy. Innovation happens behind closed doors. The interests of the shareholders of the corporations doing this innovating and the quarterly earnings targets of these companies are the primary goal. Any social good is a secondary consideration at best. This is capitalism, after all, and without profits, you can't have a business. So in spite of any appeals to the contrary, companies are required to seek profit first and above all else. And you might ask me, well, Zach, what do you mean? I vote with my wallet. I buy products that seem useful, and the ones that sell the most are the ones that are the most useful, thereby demonstrating the democratic nature of innovation. And my response would be, yes. I'm so glad we have computers inside our refrigerators, but 1 in 5 children in the US suffer from hunger because their families can't afford food. Or it's so great that you can choose from 30 varieties of toothpaste, but dental insurance is expensive and no one has it and it's barely useful to begin with. Cool! Innovation under capitalism is fundamentally anti-democratic. Any technological innovation seeks first and foremost to augment surplus value for the capitalist class. Now, this doesn't mean that certain technologies haven't been beneficial to people, and this is a very important point. In a recent interview, I discussed new technologies that help people with type 1 diabetes manage their conditions in more efficient and less invasive ways. This is super important. But I also need to ask, who has access to this care? How is it priced? What are the patents on it, and who owns those patents? Who are the major shareholders in the companies that produce it? How much are they earning? What I mean here is that technological innovation itself is not inherently problematic, but its primary function in society is tied to its role in the political economic system of that society, and those two things cannot be separated. Silicon Valley has done a very good job of fooling us that they can. Companies like Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Meta, etc., have the capital to invest in quite literally making the future, and then they have the ad budget to sell it to us as solving urgent problems or making life more convenient so we can spend more time, working for less money at jobs that are increasingly precarious. It's super.
Also create a logo for my fantasy. I just noticed this. So create a logo for my fantasy football team featuring an animal wearing a helmet and dump out half a gallon of water in the process.
Yeah, super. Indeed, when humans aspire to become the probabilistic models that live in the databases of corporations, because it will help them navigate the constant crises manufactured by capitalism, and then corporations treat people as if they are those very models, the solution to any problem, no matter how big or complex, appears to be a technical one, and perhaps even a computational one. If only we can use AI to grow more crops, says Microsoft through their spokesperson, Common, when we should be redistributing wealth and not destroying the environment by entertaining ourselves with chatbots that take water away from kids in Arizona or Texas. This attitude that all problems are fundamentally technical ones is what Evgeny Morozov calls technological solutionism. Technological solutionism under neoliberalism is also of a perniciously individualist and consumerist nature. Indeed, not only are all problems construed as technical ones that generally operate at the level of the individual, but that individual solution is one that you can buy, that is, if you're wealthy enough. Like instead of building functional high-speed public transit, apparently we should all just buy our own electric cars, never mind the massive environmental toll that harvesting all those minerals like tantalum and lithium and disposing of the batteries will eventually take. Just electrify your own personal vehicle. Like our AI friend upstairs tells us, we cannot do anything except consume products. Politics, real politics, meaning collective action and democratic self-determination, is off limits. As our AI friend recommends a product to you, she might tell you, in a society in which we are forced to pursue individual solutions to systemic problems, a society that is fundamentally undemocratic, primarily oligarchic, and in which we are conceived of not as citizens or even people, buying stuff is the only way we know to soothe our anxieties, fix problems, or make the world better. And it never really works, does it? All right, well, that was depressing. Just like in Forster's story, and spoiler alert, when the machine stops, in the story called The Machine Stops, it's not good for the people living there, right? And our own machine is stopping. And most times we just can't tell because the sausage-making process and its consequences have been strategically obscured or concealed from our view, or they've become naturalized to the point at which we accept the absurdity of the dystopian situation in which we live. I mean, just look at LinkedIn for 5 minutes, okay? A project manager at Google actually wrote this. If you are looking for a job right now, remember this. Things are tough. Hundreds of people are applying for the same roles. Applications and interviews can be time-consuming. Layoffs are impacting thousands of people. Anxiety is high. Competition for roles is high. It's okay to take breaks as you search. Be kind to yourself. Oh, okay, person whose company and its anti-democratic and anti-labor innovations have, more than almost any other company, produced the situation we're living in and that you are describing? Does this person not understand irony? Like, what? Sorry about your mics, Bob. But there's also the possibility that things can change. And we'd like to get you thinking about that as we wrap up. I want to talk about Luddism first in labor organizing. People use the term Luddism or being a Luddite generally in the pejorative today. They say, I'm a Luddite, I don't understand technology or something like that. But that's not what Luddism was, and that's not what the Luddites were trying to do. Luddism is not anti-technology as such. It was a movement that was opposed to technologies that exploited and harmed workers. This means it's connected to the history of organized labor, and an organized working class is precisely what is required to take back the means of production from the capitalist class, as well as to have the confidence and bravery to actively sabotage the technologies that are exploiting the working class and the environment if and when this is deemed necessary through democratic decision-making within the organized working class. We encourage folks to take a look at Brian Merchant's new book, Blood in the Machine, Gavin Mueller's book, Breaking Things at Work, Andreas Malm's book, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and Andrew Culp and Thomas de Kaiser's film, Machines in Flames. Again, because Luddism is not inherently anti-technology, it presupposes a fundamentally different type of innovation, one which was explained perhaps best by Ivan Illich in his 1973 book, Tools for Conviviality, which if you haven't read, I'd encourage you to. Illich asks us the question, what if the design criteria for all tools, meaning literally anything humans use, ranging from roads to medical devices, were democratically determined? No more Silicon Valley foisting innovation on us from above. No more patent applications being filed for floating warehouses or AI inside your fridge. No more new iPhones every single year that are no different than the previous one and only allow you to be exploited in novel ways. The people democratically decide what they need and work together to realize it. Other inspiration for a directly democratic approach to technological innovation can be found in the documentation by folks like Arturo Escobar of the struggles and triumphs of communities in the global South, such as the Zapatistas. We encourage you all to look at Escobar's work as well. It's profoundly influential for both Gabi and myself. Aaron Benanov's book, Automation and the Future of Work, contains one of the most interesting and detailed proposals for democratically determining and equitably distributing what he calls socially necessary labor. Again, it's another really wonderful book to examine a totally different way of engaging with technology as a society. Paired with a Luddite approach to technology, a commitment to the organization of the working class, and a commitment to autonomous communal self-determination, degrowth presents a very attractive prospect for how to imagine a future that reckons with the relationship between people, technology, and the unavoidable physical limit imposed by the law of entropy. So degrowth is a term that is contested and has lots of different meanings for different sort of constituencies, but broadly, it is increasingly mobilized by scholars and activists to criticize the hegemony of growth and a proposal for a radical reorganization of society that leads to a drastic reduction in the use of energy and resources that's deemed necessary, desirable, and possible. Degrowth starts from the fact, demonstrated by an increasing number of studies, that any further economic growth in industrialized countries is unsustainable, even if that growth is green or inclusive, or even as part of a transformative progressive agenda that massively invests in renewable energies and the sustainable transition. Industrialized countries cannot reduce their environmental impact, such as emissions, material throughput, etc., fast and sufficiently enough, while at the same time growing their economies. And this, comrades, is where we will leave you for today. We realize this ending feels a bit abrupt, but we're interested in hearing what you have to say. We wanted to make sure there was time for questions. A couple other things I want to mention. There's some kind of inspirational quotes that can infuse our optimism. But in the interest of time, one of the things that we didn't do was cite every single quote or statistic that we used. But giving credit where credit's due is super important. And they're all included on our website for our project, which you can visit if you like. It's also on the receipt printout that a user gets when they visit, or a viewer gets when they visit the piece upstairs. The URL is cultureindustry.club/blessed or blessed. Yeah, we'll keep it on this slide, I guess. Yeah, that's it. We're done. Yeah, we're done. Hey, all right, we're done. Good work. I need some water.
Yeah, me too. The thing that Zach didn't want to mention, I think, we actually didn't even talk about it, was
What
that,
did I mention?
well, he has his own book.
No,
that
I
he
do.
wrote, called Interfaces and Us. There's more information about it at the front desk.
He's my hype man.
I am. I'm taking 10% of all sales, so... which I haven't gotten my check yet.
I haven't gotten any
You haven't got
royalties
any-
yet.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's in there somewhere.
It's in there.
It's in there. It's going through space.
Zach,
Mm-hmm.
can
Oh.
I make a comment?
Bob has a mic. Yeah.
No, I will talk loudly enough without the technology. I really enjoy your talk. I think you guys are great. This 60s radical made a comment quoting a Nobel laureate, Bob Dylan's line, "Fearing not, I'll become my enemy in the instant that I preach." Everything you're doing is based on this technology. And if you break one point because you want to get rid of that because it's destructive, you will probably create a domino effect. So
This was our plant. We didn't even talk beforehand.
Yeah. I don't even know your name, and yet here we are. Here we are.
I'm Lynn Bach, MAMLS, background in in area studies and economic development, and my husband is a computer science professor here, tenured. And we've been saying for over 30 years, and I helped people learn how to use computers. I've been a librarian. It was really great before it went commercial.
Yeah.
Seriously, no laws, nothing was put into effect, no guidelines before it just went up for sale.
Do you want to? I guess so. There's a bunch of stuff in there that probably we should.
This isn't. Yeah.
Well, we'll start with the first part. The first part.
And you get our Europe all at the very end. So, it's all.
And yeah, have you seen the piece upstairs?
No, that's what
Oh.
So I think
If you have that question now.
But you're right that we are using technology to. This is one of the pieces of feedback we get all the time. It's like, well, why are you using technology to critique some of the things that have come to pass because of that very technology? I think it's a good question, and I don't think there's a really good way to button up and say, oh, well, we're immune to that criticism. I don't think that's possible to be immune to that criticism. But I do think it's worth thinking about the way that we are transparent about it. So the AI avatar in the space actually talks to viewers about sort of what she's doing while she's doing it. But also we have, and Gabi can talk about this in a little bit more detail, which is we monitor the energy usage and carbon emissions of the piece itself.
And output.
And output.
Almost live. This interaction.
Yeah, and it tells viewers
I'm saying, what's the solution? You're taking over. I'm in my 70s. You're taking over.
I'm tired. I have a 4-year-old at
taking
home. We
over?
both have 4-year-olds at home. Yeah. Anyway.
The other thing I just wanted to say too, in terms of the question about solutions or what we do, again, to me is very much baked into you kind of alluded to this moment prior to, I don't know, the commodification of computation as we know it today. And I think that I'm not entirely sure. Again, I think any sort of innovation under the regime of neoliberalism will tend to have most of its benefits accrue to the capitalist class. However, I think it's important that innovation and technological development emerge from the people and from the needs of the people. And that will never happen when you have somebody like Jeff Bezos, right? Or somebody like Elon Musk. It's just not happening. So to me, that is the solution, is a democratic approach to innovation and communal autonomy, meaning that innovation would look different theoretically here as opposed to somewhere else, whether that's in Michigan or whether that's in Colombia or Chile or whatever, right? Like all of that would look wildly different. It's almost impossible to fathom.
And just a real quick kind of vignette almost that I like to use to think about this. Plastic, right? Plastic is, we all can agree, boo plastic, right? We agree. Plastic is extremely important for a lot of people in this world, right? It is durable, it is hygienic, right? Again, we have young children at home, and so within a very rapid moment, right, plastic was everywhere in our lives. We're like, oh my God, plastic.
Going to the hospital, right?
Yeah.
Kids in the, like in the birthing area,
right? Yeah,
right? You're like,
plastic. Yeah,
plastic is everywhere.
We decided a few years ago that plastic straws were the enemy, right? And a very important community, right, the disability community, disabled folks said, no, hold up, we need plastic straws. And everyone said, you can use other things. And they said, no, we really cannot. I consider that to be one of the greatest coups on the part of the petroleum and plastics industry, right? They convinced us, and we found out very soon that this was a completely erroneous, report based on a 9-year-olds are wonderful, but a 9-year-old's book report, right? That plastic straws were destroying the earth. And it was an easy thing that legislation could push through and everyone could agree on. And we were just discarding an entire community that said, we need these things. Why don't you stop flying your private jets? Why don't, so forth and so on. I could go on for too long, right? That's an example of a failure. But it was a moment where we could have made the right decision. And it's also a moment where we could have said, it's not a blanket, right? It's not a yes or no. We're going to go back there and then we'll come back. Okay, thank you so much.
Ooh, I like your sweatshirt.
Thank you. So this year, the hot topic seems to be generative AI models, whether they're for language or pictures. But everybody seems to be confusing these with sort of actual generalized artificial intelligence, which they are totally not. Do you have any comments on that particular confusion and suggestions for how we might try to communicate the difference to the general public?
Actually, can we give the mic back real quick? Because I have a follow-up question.
Sure.
I guess my question is why is that an important distinction?
Well, I know a lot of people that are involved in writing or art, and so they are very anti-generative AI, for at least in terms of trying to use them to replace artists, which seems to be the trend. But also, in terms of policy and legislation and prospects for trying to regulate this sort of thing, the confusion between generative statistical probabilistic models and actual understanding seems to be a distinction that is likely to elude the average legislator.
You're not wrong there. I guess, and I'll, Zach, if you want to jump in, but I guess I don't, at least in the context of what we're dealing with here today, I see no reason for the distinction. I really don't.
I agree. I think that in the grand scheme of things, like whether or not general artificial intelligence is, possible, desirable, whatever. You've got Nick Bostrom over here saying, computers are going to get advanced and they're going to kill us all. And then you've got Mark Andreessen saying, I'm a techno-optimist.
Blessed is the machine.
Or whatever. Yeah, that's all he says.
Right? He didn't use those words, but he may as well have.
Two points about that. Both of those people have material invested interests in people believing what they say, and they will profit from that. So that's part one. And part two is that in both of those cases, the amount of, whether it's columbite tantalite, lithium, bauxite that goes into the aluminum, the cases on those servers that are running this stuff, and then the impacts on the subjectivities of the populations who are being affected by these things. I don't think there's a reason for, first of all, I don't think there's a reason for a distinction. And second of all, I don't think most of it needs to exist. Just full stop. Like, I don't think most of it needs to exist.
Yeah, definitely have time or two. Dave.
So early on, you blamed capitalism for pollution, essentially. And isn't it true that during the Cold War, a lot of the worst pollution and environmental degradation was in the Warsaw Pact countries? So I would argue it's not capitalism, it's technology.
That's interesting.
Okay, but
So
who
this
can
is-
do
so
relative
this is
conditions of
complicated.
Those countries. I mean,
Lenin was-
This is. I mean,
Well, Lenin was obsessed with the Fordist factory, first of all. So that, like, later in his writings, Lenin had a fixation on industrialization. And if you're like a really orthodox historical materialist, you believe that you need to go through certain phases in order to achieve sort of like luxury communism or whatever we think it's going to be. So you need to achieve industrialization, which is itself like an extractive thing. There were people, not the Bolsheviks, who wanted to do sort of more bottom-up work with the peasants and not industrialize in the way that the Bolsheviks wanted to, especially Bolsheviks later on, like as the sort of revolution sort of continues. But the other thing I would say is that by the time we enter the Cold War, at least according to the Johnson-Forrest tendency, which was Ruya Denovskaya and C.L.R. James and a number of other writers, their analysis of the Soviet economy was what they called state capitalism, which was the state sort of owned the means of production. It wasn't the workers. It wasn't the people that owned the means of production, right? It wasn't a union of Soviets at that point. And so I think that like the characterizations of, oh, well, really existing communism or really existing socialism didn't do X. Well, lots of times we haven't had the chance to experience really existing socialism, in part because of the CIA, or in part because of all the other things that like the US has done or other imperialist nations have done. And you've got Chile. Chile is a great example. We will never know how amazing this world would have been if Allende hadn't been killed, right?
Talk to me. I did papers when I was in grad school. My good friend in school was Chilean, and we worked down there in the 90s. And heard about from colleagues down there and some of the major professors here who were actually persecuted by some government agencies who are not here anymore, but I was privileged to study with. I could tell you a story, John. Yeah. So
that covers it for me.
making excellent points.
A+. We're going to go on the bell curve. To this
I'm not-
day.
Again, I'm not a historian, but I try to at least understand the specifics of some of this stuff.
Yeah, thanks. I was wondering if you could go into a little more detail about that paper you showed analyzing facial topography to determine sexual orientation. That kind of is a step backward, isn't it, to the so-called science of phrenology of the 19th century?
Yes.
Phrenology is back in a big way, my friend. And you know what? It's because of people saying, well, it's a computer now that's telling us about the phrenology as opposed to it just being like some, kooky scientist guy. And so now everyone's like, oh, well, that's legitimate because a bunch of like data says it is.
We don't have time to get into my other research, but briefly, you go to the doctor. A doctor asks you how much pain you're in, scale of 1 to 10, right? In a few years, maybe 5, maybe 10. At this rate, I don't know how fast things are coming to the fore, right? They're going to be putting implants in your. It's going to sound so kooky. Oh my God, I'm going to say this out loud. They're going to put implants in your brain. They're going to attach a little computer to you. They're going to track you during the day. And they're going to say, no, you did feel pain or you did not feel pain. Okay, these are celebrated studies that are out today, and the question is, who's going to get to decide whether or not you feel pain? Now, I bring that example up because, to Zach's point, we are letting machine learning systems, large learning models, large neural nets, right? Letting them, and they are not sentient, but we are letting them make determinants about our health, about our existence, about what benefits we get, about what jobs we get. There are AI systems that will, if you are interviewing for a job over Zoom, an interviewer will use it to track your face to determine whether or not you're telling the truth or whether or not you'd be a good right for the job. Right?
There's
so
voice,
many examples.
The interview, no, not the interview. There's there's conference software that tells you whether or not you are charismatic in a meeting. And that will determine your ability to get promoted at work. Netflix uses it.
So, yeah.
Cool company.
So the short answer is yes. The longer answer is yes.
Okay, maybe one more. I know we were at about time. Yeah.
Well, Zach, what year did you graduate from?
This is a great question. I graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, one of the best institutions in the world, in the year 2006.
I thought it was early. Anyway, so now I'm going to look silly asking this question because at one point I have this foggy memory that you came to see me about taking access to a classroom between.
I know what you're talking about.
And I sat there and talked to you, and my sensors were telling me, okay, he's trustworthy. Okay. And my sensors were also saying internally, I don't have a clue what he's talking about. and I just said, yeah, it sounds, no fires, right? Okay, it sounds fine. So I was probably a little bit older than you are now, and you talked about something that I had really no knowledge of. I think it was called social networking. And I can't wait until you sit in there across from a student and you go, I have no idea what you're talking about. Let's try it. So if there is a question, it will be, what's that going to look like when a student comes to you and says, listen, I want to take over this classroom, and then I want to do, and you're going to go, what?
Yes. I hope so.
The most constant is change. Yeah. Look.